In 2025, the United States government spent $970 billion in interest on the national debt. Just interest. The bill for money the government had already borrowed and spent in years gone by. And that was just the carrying cost, not the principal, just the price of owing what is owed. In 2026, that number is projected to cross $1 trillion. The Treasury is currently paying roughly $3 billion per day in interest. If you've never thought about the US debt in those terms before, you're about to, because that number changes the conversation entirely. Let's start with the mechanics, because they are simpler than political debates make them sound. And understanding them is what separates people who think clearly about this from people who just repeat whatever their favorite cable channel told them last Tuesday. The national debt is the total amount of money the federal government has borrowed and not yet repaid. It grows whenever the government spends more in a year than it collects in taxes. That annual gap is the deficit. The debt is the running total of all those deficits going back decades. Because confused audiences are easier to alarm or reassure depending on what's needed in that particular news cycle. As of May 2026, the total gross national debt stands at approximately $39 trillion. That's roughly $114,000 per person, or $289,000 per household. Now, who holds this debt? Because most people assume the answer is China. Foreign governments and investors hold roughly a quarter of the total. China holds some, Japan holds slightly more, but the majority is held domestically by American banks, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and individual investors who bought treasury bonds. When Americans worry about the national debt, they are largely worrying about money the government owes to other Americans. And the geopolitical panic about China owning America? It is significantly overstated relative to the actual numbers. I know, that may be disappointing if you had a good conspiracy going. Then there's the part that almost never gets discussed. Roughly 20% of the debt is money the government owes to itself, specifically to the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. When those programs run surpluses, they're legally required to invest in Treasury securities. The government spends that money on current operations and leaves an IOU in the jar. That IOU can only be honored later by raising taxes, cutting spending, or borrowing more. Which is why the debt conversation and the Social Security conversation are ultimately the same conversation, whether politicians acknowledge it or not. The United States has carried national debt since its founding, not as a failure, but as a deliberate design choice. Alexander Hamilton argued in 1790 that a national debt, properly managed, was a national blessing. His reasoning was that debt backed by a functioning government creates a financial instrument investors trust. A trusted government borrows cheaply, funds public goods, and projects stability. That logic held for most of American history. Debt spiked during wars and fell during peacetime as the economy outgrew it. After World War II, debt exceeded 100% of GDP. By the mid-1970s, it had fallen to around 30%. Not through reducing spending and raising taxes, but through growth. Hamilton's framework was working. Then it broke. Gradually enough that each individual step seemed reasonable. The Reagan era introduced significant tax cuts paired with expanded defense spending. Structural deficits, meaning deficits that persist even during economic growth, became normalized for the first time. The discipline of paying down debt during good years quietly vanished from political practice. And here's the bipartisan part that neither side wants to hear. Republicans found it easier to cut taxes than to cut spending. Democrats found it easier to expand programs than to raise taxes to pay for them. The result was the same regardless of who held power. The balance grew. The 2000s piled on. Tax cuts, 2 unfunded wars, the 2008 financial crisis requiring massive emergency spending at the exact moment revenues collapsed. Then COVID. Approximately $5 trillion in relief across 2020 and 2021 alone. 2 years. More than the entire national debt as recently as 1990. If you're keeping score at home, please stop. It will only upset you. By 2026, debt held by the public has surpassed total GDP for the first time since World War II. Except this time, there was no post-war boom waiting to grow the ratio back down. There was just the interest bill, compounding quietly in the background, waiting for rates to rise. This is the part that is simultaneously the most consequential and the least discussed. And the reason it's been underreported is simple. For over a decade, low interest rates made it easy to ignore. Between 2008 and 2022, the US could borrow cheaply. Interest payments, while large, were a manageable share of the budget. You could argue about the debt in the abstract, while the carrying cost remained relatively gentle. Many people did exactly that. It was like arguing about your credit card balance while the introductory 0% APR was still running. Technically concerning, practically painless, until the rate resets. And the rate always resets. Inflation returned in 2021 and 2022. The Fed raised rates at the fastest pace in 4 decades. And the cost of carrying what is now $39 trillion in debt became expensive with a speed that caught a lot of people off guard. Interest payments nearly tripled over 5 years. In 2025, the bill hit $970 billion. The CBO projects it will reach $1 trillion in 2026, and more than double to $2.1 trillion by 2036. Interest is already the second largest item in the federal budget, behind only Social Security, and larger than Medicare, Medicaid, or defense. The government is now spending roughly $3 billion every single day just to service past borrowing. That's $3 billion a day that builds nothing, funds nothing, and solves nothing. It is the cost of yesterday billed to today. That is not a partisan observation. That is basic maths, and maths does not negotiate. Now, who benefits from this? The bondholders, the institutional investors, pension funds, banks, and foreign governments collecting those interest payments. Nearly $1 trillion a year flowing from American taxpayers to the holders of Treasury securities. That's a wealth transfer operating quietly in the background of every budget debate, and it rarely gets framed that way. And if the gap between what gets reported in the US debt and what actually matters has been an eye-opener, subscribe. This channel's goal is to cover the most essential topics that directly affect you with a clear and fresh perspective. There is more of this to come. Here's where I have to give you both sides of a genuine disagreement, because this is genuinely contested and you deserve the actual debate rather than one side dressed up as certainty. The case that the debt is manageable. The US borrows in its own currency, so it can't be forced into default the way a household or smaller nation can. The US Treasury bonds remain the world's premier reserve asset. Global demand for them has consistently exceeded supply for decades. And what ultimately matters is the debt to GDP ratio. And this can improve without paying down a single dollar, simply by growing the economy faster than the debt grows. The case that it's a problem. Nearly $1 trillion in annual interest and rising, steadily crowding out productive investment. The risk here is that if investors start to doubt America's ability to manage its finances, they'll demand higher interest rates to keep lending, which makes the debt even more expensive. The finances look even worse and causes investors to demand even higher rates. It's a spiral. And right now, spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest already takes up so much of the budget that there's almost nothing left for things like infrastructure, education, or research, the stuff that actually builds a future. The CBO already projects that by 2048, interest will become the single largest federal expenditure, meaning the government will spend more servicing its past than investing in its future. Both arguments are legitimate. The US has genuine structural advantages that make its debt more sustainable than comparable levels would be for other countries. It also has genuine vulnerabilities that compound over time if left unaddressed. The thing that should concern you the most is not a dramatic default. It's quieter and slower. It's $3 billion a day in interest, growing, crowding out the government's capacity to fund anything that builds toward the future. And it's a political system that cannot have an honest conversation about either raising taxes or cutting popular programs because both carry electoral costs neither party will absorb. That is not a financial crisis. It is a governance crisis. And if history has consistently taught us anything, it will be that it is harder to resolve than the financial crises they eventually produce. Hamilton thought a national debt, properly managed, was a national blessing. He was right, but the most essential word in that sentence is properly, and it determines the outcome of everything.